Welcome, everyone, to Gramercy Books Author Night, featuring prize-winning biographer Anne Sebba in conversation with noted historian David Steigerwald about Anne's latest book, Ethel Rosenberg, An American Tragedy, a moving narrative about the wife and mother whose execution for espionage-related crimes defined the Cold War and horrified the world. Ethel Rosenberg, An American Tragedy, was released earlier this month by St. Martin's Press. Many thanks to the Ohio State University Department of History and Jewish Columbus, who are Gramercy's community partners for this evening's conversation. I'm Linda Cass. We are live streaming this program through Zoom webinar, and it will be recorded. Let me preview the next hour or so for you. After introductions, Anne and David will talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. That will be followed by 15 minutes for your questions submitted in the Q&A box. You'll find that icon for the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen if you're using a desk or laptop or an iPad. This is where David will be taking your questions for Anne during the latter portion of this program. You can write your questions into this box, and I encourage you to do so at any time during the program. Those questions, liked by many others, will be upvoted, rising to the top of the Q&A box and most likely to be asked. Another tool is the chat box. This allows you to chat among yourselves, but it will not be monitored by the panelists. That icon also is on the bottom of your screen. We hope that your chats, though, don't distract you from what will be an intriguing conversation tonight. I want to draw your attention for a moment to the chat box. So click onto that icon right now. It will open a column on the right side of your screen. We've placed links for 3 upcoming author programs hosted by Gramercy Books. On Wednesday, June 30th at 7 p.m., we'll have our first hybrid program. That means it's going to be in-store and on Zoom, as we feature 2 local writers in conversation about crime fiction, and specifically the latest mystery from writer Andrew Welsh Huggins called An Empty Grave. Andrew will be interviewed by fellow Buckeye Crime Writers member Connie Berry. On Tuesday, July 13th at 7 p.m., we'll have our Gramercy Book Club, and it features award-winning author Joshua Henkin's latest novel, Morningside Heights, a tender, powerful, and big-hearted novel about love in the face of loss. Former Dispatch arts editor Nancy Gilson will interview Josh following the group discussion, which she will facilitate. Morningside Heights was named the #1 June fiction pick by booksellers across the country. And on Monday, July 19th, 7 p.m., we feature New York Times bestselling author Kristen Harmel and her novel, The Forest of Vanishing Stars, an evocative coming-of-age World War II story about a young woman who uses her knowledge of the wilderness to help Jewish refugees escape the Nazis, and this is inspired by true events. Kristen will be in conversation with fellow historical novelist Janet Beard. We encourage you to click on the link for any of these programs to learn more about them, as well as to register if you'd like. You can sign up on our website, gramercybooksbexley.com, to receive our e-newsletter and learn more about all of Gramercy Books' exciting live stream programs. And now on to tonight's program. Anne Sebba's powerful biography, coming 70 years after the trial, is the first time Ethel Rosenberg's story has been told with the full use of the dramatic and tragic prison letters that Ethel exchanged with her husband, her lawyer, and her psychotherapist over a 3-year period, 2 of them in solitary confinement. Hers is the resonant story of what happens when a government motivated by fear tramples on the rights of its citizens. Anne Sebba is a prize-winning biographer, lecturer, and former Reuters foreign correspondent who has written several books, including That Woman and Les Parisiens. A former chair of Britain's Society of Authors and now on the council, Anne is also a senior research fellow at the Institute of Historical Research. She lives in London and is staying up quite late to talk with us this evening. And it is a thrill to welcome you tonight and for Gramercy Books to share your extraordinary biography with our Central Ohio community.
Thank you. Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to be with you. Thank you for inviting me and hosting this event.
And we're excited for the conversation that you'll have, Anne, with David Steigerwald, a professor of history at The Ohio State University. He teaches courses in 20th century America, ranging from World War I through the 60s. He's the recipient of the university's highest recognition for teaching excellence, the Alumni Distinguished Teaching Award. He was also awarded the College of Arts and Sciences Outstanding Teaching Award. Dr. Steigerwald directs the History Department's World War II Study Abroad program. David, welcome to Gramercy Books, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Linda. I appreciate the invitation to be here, and very much been looking forward to meeting Anne and talking about this book.
Well, I'm going to get out of everyone's way. Thanks to all of you in our audience for joining us this evening. Now, a warm, warm welcome to Anne Sebba in conversation with David Steigerwald.
Well, hello, Anne. How are you?
Hello, I'm absolutely fine. And thank you for taking such an interest in this extraordinary story. I think we've got lots to talk about.
I think we do. It's a pleasure to meet you and a pleasure to see you with yet another new book that tells us a lot about mid-century history. So let's get to it, okay? This is a well-trod story and has engaged a lot of historians over the years, a lot of journalists. It certainly was one of the biggest stories of its day. So I wonder if you could start us off by talking about how you got interested in it, at what point you discovered that you had something to say that hasn't been said before. And I'm wondering whether it was because of your engagement with new materials, or whether you came at this project with a really clear idea of what you were going to have to say about Ethel.
Thank you. Gosh, lots to say about that. I'll deal with the easy part first, how I became interested in it, because it goes back a long way. Although I'm in London, I did live in New York, in Brooklyn, for a couple of years when I was newly married. I started life as a foreign correspondent for Reuters. And in 1978, when I was pregnant for the first time, Reuters decided that actually being a mother and a foreign correspondent didn't go together. So they sacked me. And I came to live with my husband and baby in New York. I had time on my hands because I didn't have a job anymore. And I discovered American literature. And one of the books that sank deep into my psyche at this point was Edgar Doctorow's, E.L. Doctorow, the Book of Daniel. And somehow I didn't get it out of my system. I know it's fictionalized. I know it's about a son and a daughter, not two sons, but I happen to have a son and a daughter. So it struck a chord. And then I started writing books. And my most recent book, which we were talking about earlier, was a book about women in wartime Paris, Les Parisiennes. And when I finished that, the publisher said to me, well, there are lots of spies in that book. Can't you write a new biography about one of those spies? And there really wasn't one that completely obsessed me, but somehow I remembered Ethel. And I didn't know in detail about her story. All I did know was that whenever you mentioned it to anybody, they would join Ethel and Julius together and talk about, the Rosenbergs, the spies. And I began to think, well, maybe they're different people. Maybe they shouldn't be tied together. So that brings me on to answer the second part of your question, what's new about my book? So there is new material, but I wanted to bring to it some kind of feminist understanding. I wanted to extrapolate Ethel. I wanted to see Ethel as a 1950s, 1940s wartime housewife in her own right. And I think that really hadn't been done. I didn't know that I would find a clear difference. So, in a sense, when you start a book, that's a worry. You may find something that doesn't fit the narrative, because I think you should start with a relatively open mind. But the new material is partly a feminist interpretation. I think Ethel has always been portrayed as either a victim or a martyr. I'm not sure, in my view, she's either. The Ethel I discovered through reading the letters actually has agency. She's her own woman, and certainly by the end. So I found that interesting. But there is, of course, new information. David, her brother, and I'm sure we'll come on to talking about the family dynamics, but for those of you that don't know, her brother David was key to all this story, and his perjured evidence was what actually sent Ethel to her death. And David died in 2014. So finally, his grand jury statements were released. And that was what made clear that he had lied, and that he really had no remorse for the lying, but it was his statement that he had seen his sister typing, which was not part of his grand jury statement, where he actually said, "My sister had no part of this, leave my sister out of it." So it was the release of the grand jury papers. It was also the letters, which Linda referred to in the introduction, the prison letters. I immersed myself in those, and while I fully accept that some of them were written for publication, not all of them were. And I found them so extraordinarily moving, how Ethel tried to be a mother from prison. I think the letter that stands out in my mind is the first occasion when she was due to see her children in prison, and how she prepared for that visit. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about that. The other thing was visiting the psychotherapist who had looked after her firstborn son, Michael. I flew to California to see her, and what she told me about Ethel I found revelatory. The letters in Boston University are also extraordinary, because the FBI seized the letters between David, who we've talked about, and his wife, Ruth. And what you see there is their very clear belief in communism, although they tried to say that they were persuaded to do all this by Julius and Ethel. Actually, it's quite clear when you read the letters that they didn't need any persuasion. So it's an interpretation of the letters, the grand jury statement, and mostly it's seeing Ethel as her own woman. I find Ethel immensely complex. It's not easy to put one label on her as communist or wife, although many people tried to. She's all of those things: communist, wife, mother, and above all, a loyal wife. So she's just more complex than rolling her up into part of the Rosenbergs. And certainly, in my view, not a spy, but we'll come on to that. That's far too complex just to dismiss now.
Well, let's keep working into the family story, because that's really the great contribution that I think you've made here. You've embedded Ethel in a really complicated family situation that is both one of personality and sort of predictable family dynamics, in the sense that every family has got these kinds of things. But I was also really impressed with their hard scrabble existence. And so that their economic difficulties really were always a kind of backstory, or front story for that matter. So talk please about where she fit in her family, especially her relationships with her mother, which were really crucial to the story, I think.
Yes.
And go to it.
I find the family story really of such dramatic intensity. It's really a Shakespearean tragedy. It's why I wanted the word tragedy in my subtitle. I mean, it's a tragedy at so many levels. So Ethel was born in 1915. She had a much older stepbrother, but that was her father had a wife who died. For her mother, who was semi-illiterate and never able to lift herself out of this intense poverty that you described, they grew up in a cold water tenement on the Lower East Side. That means that the WC was on the landing. If they wanted a bath, they went to a local bathhouse, or they washed in the kitchen sink. Intense poverty. The only window was front and back. So to begin with, Ethel didn't have a window even. She did eventually. And her father, Barney, ran a repair shop, which was at the front of the tenement. After Ethel's birth, there were two other sons, but the youngest son, David, was born after a number of miscarriages and difficulties, and by all accounts was a much wanted, much loved, adored, chubby cheeked, curly haired little boy who everybody adored, including Ethel, who became a surrogate mother. She used to read to David, but David was not blessed with great brains, and Ethel was. That's the extraordinary thing. So for Ethel, I think that the real life-changing event was going to this school, Seward Park High School, which was one of these New Deal schools. And having been there, I can see why it changed her whole outlook on life. It had an almost Olympic-sized swimming pool, an Olympic-sized library, and a vast theatre. So this enabled Ethel, who was clearly a very bright girl, moved up a year to expand her horizons. And she decided that she wanted to sing and to act and to play music. And all of that was fine, except that she had to leave school aged 15 because she needed to go out to work. She needed to go out to work because the family needed her contribution. She could have gone to college, in that college for women was just opening up, but it was out of the question as far as her family was concerned. So although she left school at 15, she was really something of an autodidact. She continued her education by going to join acting classes at the settlement houses. And it was there that she met like-minded people who talked about how to change the world and what was wrong with the world. But she had to take a secretarial, a clerical course, and her first job was at a packing company. And age 19, she wasn't even 20, she got involved in a strike. I think there are two aspects of Ethel growing up that I'd just like to draw attention to, because I think they're both important and they show her extraordinary determination. One of them was she auditioned to sing with the Schola Cantorum at Carnegie Hall, not just any old choir, but the best choir. And they rejected her the first time round because she couldn't sight sing. Well, of course she couldn't. She hadn't learnt. But instead of giving up and saying, oh, well, that's not for me, she bought a piano. It was the Depression. People were throwing furniture out. She put the piano in her front room and taught herself how to sight sing, went back for a second audition and was taken on, probably the youngest, to sing with Schola Cantorum. And so that exposed her to European classical culture and music, and must have broadened her outlook. The other determination that you see in her, the other aspect, is that there was a strike at the packing company where she worked. They wanted their union to be recognized. They wanted to merge with a bigger union. They were fighting for better pay and better conditions. And Ethel clearly took a lead in all of this and was one of those who lay down on the street on her raincoat to prevent the lorries coming in. She was sacked, lost her money for 6 months, but the newly established Labour Relations Board which which examined the dispute, found that Ethel did not deserve to be sacked and ordered that she was given back pay. So those two events show a lot about her personality, but they also were responsible for forming her personality. Meantime, David, her younger brother, was at school, and he was obviously impressed by his older sister, who was really exposing herself to the world. So although he was a younger brother, there was an element of looking up to the success of Ethel, who met her husband Julius in 1936 when she was singing at a fundraising gala. They were married in 1939. And although Julius was younger, Ethel and Julius somehow embodied for David an aspirational couple. She sang in Italian. She was worried about problems in the world and communism. So David always looked up to Ethel as somebody who really had, not in financial terms, but almost made something of the world. Perhaps the best word to use is aspirational.
Yeah, I think that is good. It also fed into that talent that she had, and her greater worldliness, if we can use that word, as well, ended up being one of the things held against her once she was arrested and then dragged through the court system. And I think it's a sharp contrast between her and Julius. If I read you right, he wasn't nearly so talented as her, or broadly talented, it seems to me. And so what was the dynamic between them that you see?
Well, the thing about Ethel's singing is that she was self-motivated, because of course you were talking about the family earlier, and I didn't talk about the fact that her mother was so uninterested. Ethel's mother, Tessie, was completely underwhelmed by all of this. She just didn't think that for women a career mattered at all, and all the love and ambition went into the younger son, into David, who was always known as Davy or Doovy even. So I think Ethel was learned from that. I think the lesson Ethel took away from that is that ultimately you are actually on your own in life. It's a real hard lesson to learn, but that she had to do what she felt was right, that maybe there would be nobody who would come to her rescue. However, Julius clearly admired her. So here for the first time was a man who really valued her talents. And I think that speaks a lot to what she fell in love with. I think it was a very physical passion actually as well on both sides. But I have to say that for Ethel, being valued and admired must have been very heady stuff. And although they became a unit, I still think that Ethel had learnt that ultimately what she made of her life was going to be her decision, because her father was not against her, but her father was weak. He couldn't stand up for her. And her mother really had never come to listen to her sing, had never praised her, had never made her feel valued. So that was really very important. By the time that Julius and Ethel had children themselves, in 1943, Michael was born, in 47, Robbie, Ethel was absolutely determined to be the best mother she absolutely could. I think one of the things that really motivated Ethel was distancing herself from her mother's family, the Greenglasses, and that just grew. It became corrosive once she saw how David and his wife Ruth had betrayed them. But even before that, I think what Ethel wanted to do was to be the best mother she possibly could. And all the stories about Ethel are really quite extraordinary, how she'd get down on the floor to play with her children. She wanted them to call her Ethel. She was determined to feed them and play games with feeding. Some of the other mothers thought that this was weak. I think it was just Ethel's total determination, and she went to mothering classes to be a better mother. So, you know, when money was tight, she nonetheless decided that this was so important and mattered to her to be the best mother she could, and quite different from her mother, to encourage her children with singing and music. She went to music lessons so that she could then teach her children to sing. And it obviously lasted because they remember it. It's something that penetrated into their psyches.
And the son's devotion to her ever since really speaks to the power of their relationship. I think that much is very clear. Let me ask you this. One of the ideas that I think is working through your narrative is that for whatever else she was up to, Ethel, in a way, took part in the cult of domesticity after the war, the feminine mystique, essentially, on the Lower East Side. And I'm just struck by how her own aspirations were redirected to marriage and to motherhood. And she seized those things with the same kind of enthusiasm and determination to be really good at them that she had shown to her music, right? And this takes her out of the kind of murky realm of spying and puts her firmly in the place of American women generally, or what was expected of American women after the war. So can you talk about that a little bit?
It is so interesting, isn't it? Because you have this single-minded, clever girl who really could have gone on to have a career. And obviously her life was cut short at 37, so she couldn't. But I think you see it when Julius eventually qualified, and he needed Ethel's help because he flunked one of his courses in Spanish, so Ethel had to coach him. She was encouraging him. And when he did, he still found getting work difficult. I don't think he was completely sold on being an engineer. He thought that would be vocational. But lots of commercial companies wouldn't take Jewish engineers from CCNY. So his friends were getting government work in Washington. So they both decided to take the civil service exams. And Ethel, of course, passed swiftly. So they went to Washington following Ethel. So she was the breadwinner at this point. She got a good job. And Julius was doing some occasional freelance work. And then when Julius gets a job, they come back to New York and Ethel gives up her work. So you're absolutely right. She is playing the role of the dutiful 1950s housewife. Why did she do that? I don't have a total answer to that, but I think it was part of her love for Julius, and the complication arises because what I think she was saying by this decision is, I've married a man who's going to do really well, and she wanted to show her green glass family that her choice of Julius was vindicated. And I think it's all part of that she really, what drove her, I think, was showing the green glasses that she had married somebody worthwhile. And that explains partly why she stuck to him at the end. But I think it certainly explains why she left Washington. And they came back and, you know, they lived in a variety of places. They went to both parents, which wasn't successful. And then eventually to a place of their own, a sort of very shabby room in the East Village. And Ethel at this point is working on a voluntary basis for the East Side Defense Council, hoping that America will join in the war, which of course in 1941 they do. And at this point, being a communist is okay. I mean, we've missed out a bit of history. In 1939, of course, the Soviet Nazi pact, Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, made it very difficult to be a communist, because the whole idea was to be fighting the fascists, and then they make this pact. But by 1941, this comes good, and then it's okay. And then, of course, by 1942, Julius has made himself available to the Russians, probably because there were so many rallies at this point, as the American government had to persuade everyone, Russia's now our ally, Russia's our friend. So there were a lot of rallies and films showing how courageous the Russians were. And probably that's where Julius introduces himself and offers all these friends of his from CCNY who are involved in government engineering work as possibly able to pass information. So I think at this point, Ethel probably knows, or whether she knows from the start, she soon does know that Julius is helping. I think she probably admired what he was doing, but certainly was totally involved in being a good mother. And her first child was not well. He was demanding, or as he says himself, he was challenging. And I think that took up all Ethel's energies. I mean, anyone who's had sleepless nights with a demanding firstborn child will identify. And she wasn't well herself. She had back problems, and her back problems, scoliosis, got worse at this point. So life was not easy, and they had very little money. And I think Ethel was doing everything she could to keep the family together. By the time they had two sons, they'd moved to Knickerbocker Village, so they had a slightly better house. But as an indication of their devotion to the children, they didn't have a bedroom themselves. They had a pull-down sofa that they slept on, and they gave the bedroom to the two boys. So that's really her life, and reading Parents magazine, going to mothering classes, going to music classes, trying to do everything better than her own mother.
And even engaging in therapy puts her in a place and a time, and shows a commitment to straightening out the family, her own family, especially Michael, right, and getting his behavior under control. We should probably move toward the trial and the execution, and I want to do that by talking a little bit about the evidence that we now know was there. The Venona Project was a very important part of what Cold War historians now know about subversion in the United States during the Cold War, but it was also the backdrop to the prosecution. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And before I let you do that, let me just remind people that if they have questions, please type them in.
Yeah. So let me talk about the trial and why Venona mattered to the trial. So the trial took place in March 1951, less than 3 weeks, and was full of multiple miscarriages of justice. I think really one has to call it a corrupt trial. So in essence, the judge indulged in discussions with the prosecution. The judge really, in his oral indictment, frequently used the word treason, as indeed the prosecuting attorneys used the word treason. That's of key significance because they were charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. Conspiracy is really easy to prove. In effect, you could say, as I've thought about it, that any close marriage is built on an element of complicity, if not conspiracy. And Ethel, of course, was in a close marriage. So I think you could say she was complicit to understanding. I don't believe in any way she was criminally complicit. And this introduction of treason meant that when the jury came to decide, they came to think about whether, in fact, they were judging if these people were guilty of treason. I mean, treason requires different technical evidence. But that wasn't all. The real reason why the trial was corrupt was because the only overt evidence against Ethel was actually provided by the perjury of her brother David. And as I was talking at the beginning, he invented this, or perhaps his wife Ruth invented it and he went along with it. He said that he had seen Ethel typing. It now turns out that he never saw Ethel typing. There may not have been anybody typing, but if anybody was, it was probably his wife, Ruth. There may not actually have been the evidence to type the theatrical props that were introduced at the trial, the Jello box, that of course, if there had been an original, would have been sent to Russia, and the prosecution made a big deal of this so that the jury couldn't possibly forget. And the lens mold that David was meant to have drawn. Well, David, who flunked many of his exams, was not such a technical whiz that he could possibly have provided that. So the trial was full of multiple miscarriages of justice, but the FBI and, as it turned out, the government believed that the ends justified the means, even though or the means justified the end, I think, rather, is what I should say. Even people who say, oh, well, it was, riddled with miscarriages of justice, but of course they needed to kill them both because they were a danger to America. Why did they think that? Because of this word Venona that you introduced. So Venona, which was published in 1995, was a series of messages between Moscow and New York, the cables to the KGB, which were decrypted at the end of the war. And it was these cables that were considered so valuable, they couldn't possibly reveal that they knew them because they hoped to catch more people. So they thought that if they charged both Ethel and Julius, that one of them would crack, one of them would name names, and especially if they threatened them with a death sentence. Because, and it's not known at what point the president knew about Venona, but certainly the FBI knew, and they knew from these Venona decrypts that Julius was involved in spying, in being a aspiring recruiter. Now, historians got very excited in 1995 when Venona was finally revealed. But what did they reveal about Ethel, which is what interests me? So there are thousands of these cables, of which only 3,000 were decrypted, and only 19 refer to Julius and Ethel. Only 2 of them refer to Ethel, and only 1 of them Ethel by name. And what they actually say is that she was sympathetic she knows about her husband's work, but she does not work. And the 2 men who were responsible for decrypting, Gardner and Lamfair, actually added a memo to that saying that this indicated not simply that Ethel didn't go out to work in a shop or a factory or whatever, but that Ethel, whose health was not good, did not work as a spy. Ethel had no code name, and we know from these cables all KGB spies had code names. Ethel did not, so she was referred to in this one cable by her own name. Nobody pretends that the KGB were actually dealing directly with Ethel. So it's not a crime to know, it's not a crime to think. What has to be proven is an overt act. But by charging them with conspiracy to commit espionage, it was almost impossible to disprove. Historians, depending on their prior view of communism and the Cold War, are still arguing about what Venona proves or doesn't prove. But I think it's very hard to argue against the KGB. And as far as the KGB are concerned, Ethel was not an active spy, but those who believe that because she knew and probably approved, I mean, as I say in my book, we can't know the extent to which she knew everything. She often went away in the summer. Perhaps she was sent away deliberately so she wouldn't be part of it. But, you know, that's conjecture. We don't know. There is no evidence that she was involved in active spying, and that's what Venona tells us.
If we're going to take Venona as proof that Julius was indeed engaged in espionage, it seems like we owe Ethel the very same thing. That is, that Venona seems to suggest that she was not engaged in it. If we take Venona as credible in the one case, we should take it in the same way in her case, it seems to me.
There are, you know, I would agree with you, and I take that because at some point you have to read the letters and the evidence and come to a conclusion. To what extent did she encourage Ruth? That's the other issue that people are deeply exercised over. Again, from reading the Boston letters, I would feel that Ruth and David needed little or no persuasion, but given the family dynamics and the closeness, it's possible that Ethel said, well, David should make up his mind. It's possible, but we don't know that. And even if we knew it, it's not something that you're electrocuted for.
Yeah. Let's sort of finish out our conversation by talking about we might call it the durability, or even forgive the word, afterlife of the Rosenberg case. Talk some about the resonance that it's had in American culture, American literature, American letters, American argument. And I'm particularly interested in why it seems to be Ethel who attracts this enduring interest.
Oh, that is so interesting. I mean, you're right. So it'll be nearly 70 years since their electrocution. And yet this story that divided America at the time continues to have such resonance. I'm not going to justify deciding that it's okay to be a spy. You know, I suppose Julius is of less interest to writers because he's more straightforward. You know, he decided that actually this was a good thing. Russia was our ally. Russia needed help. So he was going to give them every ounce of help that he could get his hands on. Ethel is more confused. She clearly loved her husband, was deeply loyal to him, probably believed what he was doing was the right thing, but didn't actively partake in it. And Ethel is a complex character. You know, why does someone who's so clever and so bright decide that actually her highest goal is being the best mother she can? I mean, I think I understand that. It's because there is no greater gift to the next generation than educating and providing your children with a sound basis in life. But I suppose it's because people can't quite label her. So she was a communist. I don't deny that. Of course she believed in communism, but nonetheless, she indulged in therapy, which is not a communistic act. She went to extra classes in mothering. She was Jewish, she didn't deny it, but she didn't believe in the spirituality of being Jewish. She liked the singing. She just is more interesting because we can't know precisely what she knew and how much she continued to believe in it or to protest or to devote her time entirely to the children. So, you know, you have somebody like Sylvia Plath and the Bell Jar, and if people know one line, they know it was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they executed the Rosenbergs. And I think Plath had a real understanding of the madness that was engulfing America, and particularly for women. And then, of course, Angels in America, the play where Ethel's ghost meets up with Roy Cohn. I mean, we could have spent the whole hour talking about Roy Cohn, the 23-year-old prosecutor who actually coached David in his perjury, and then went off to work for McCarthy. We haven't talked about this real fear of communism. I mean, it was an existential fear that if Russia had the bomb, why had Americans fought the World War? Perhaps they hadn't won the peace. So, this was a very scary time for many people, and the scaremongering was whipped up into fear of communists, and then, all Jews are communists. So there was that element as well. And the misogyny of the judge, who in his final speech accused Ethel of being a full-fledged partner in the crime, and a crime that's worse than murder. I mean, who blamed Ethel and Julius for the Korean War. I mean, completely over the top in his indictment and his sentencing, because she was older, 2 3/4 years older than Julius. Therefore, she must be the slave driver. She must be the master. And all of that just taps into this rich period. I mean, I think you almost, as a historian, you can almost learn more about history by looking at an individual story, and in this case, in Ethel's story. It's one thing to teach about McCarthyism and the Cold War, but to see how it impacted on one woman's life, and the fact that the government knew that there was not enough evidence to convict Ethel, and yet that somehow they were willing to treat an individual's life as expendable for the greater good. I mean, that really tells you an awful lot, in my mind, about the period and the history, and how this fear became hysteria. And once a government resorts to hysteria, I mean, there is no end to the rules that will be broken. So, I think it really behoves us to look at this story with great care.
I certainly agree that individuals are good ways to demonstrate the nature of the world that they live in. But of course, it takes a thoughtful and skillful writer to do that. And you are that in both cases. So we have this book. We don't have a great many questions in front of us, but let me throw out a couple of them that are in front of me. And I'll go in order that they appear. Christopher Purdy writes, "Hello, Anne. I enjoyed your biographies of Wallace Simpson and Mother Teresa very much. Now this heartbreaking bio of Ethel Rosenberg. 3 women who could not be more different. Is there one aspect of their personalities that made you want to write about them?"
I don't really like comparing, but I guess what I discovered, certainly in Wallace Simpson's case, I discovered this extraordinary cache of letters between her and the husband that she was publicly accusing of adultery and publicly saying she hated. But actually what you see in the letters between the two of them is that she regretted having to lose him because she didn't want to marry the prince. She'd gone too far. Well, he actually became king by 1936. And so, the public story isn't always what the private story is. I guess the other thing that unites those two stories is 1936, because 1936, in my mind, is just the key year in world history. It's the year when Hitler walked into the Rhineland, or marched his soldiers into the Rhineland, broke the treaty obligations, and there was a civil war in Spain, and many of Ethel and Julius's friends went off to Spain to fight Franco and the nationalists and support the democratically elected government. And so to become a communist in 1936, oh, and of course in France there was a Popular Front government with communism. I can absolutely see that to become a communist in 1936 was of deep importance and relevance if you wanted to fight the fascists, and especially if you were Jewish. And yet, you know, what were we doing in England? We were faffing around, worried about a king and his morals. So, you know, 1936 is really what unifies those two stories. And another piece of dreadful symmetry, that Wallace's birthday was on June the 19th, and I've always known about June the 19th. And of course, June the 19th is the date that Ethel and Julius were electrocuted. But having said that, historically, these are two completely different stories.
Thanks. Mark Barbosh writes, did you speak with the Rosenberg sons as part of your research? And if so, what did you learn from them?
Yes is the answer. Well, I live in England, so obviously I wasn't round the corner, but I took several flights before we were forbidden from doing so in COVID. And I did talk to them. I didn't really want this to be an authorized biography because I wanted that independence. I thought I would be accused of not being independent if I spoke too much, but I did want to, I thought they could help me because, you know, they have memories and they knew people. And thanks to them, I did meet the psychotherapist who I mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Elizabeth Phillips. And subsequently, having written the book that I wanted to write, I did show it to them because I wanted to have copyright to quote from the prison letters, which I found extremely moving and revealing. So at that point, the book having been written, I've had quite a lot of conversations with them.
I was really impressed that you managed to find the psychotherapist. And you say she was in her 90s when you spoke with her?
I think she's 99 or shortly about to be 100, and she's still alive. And one of the most inspiring people I've met. It just made me feel that she believed Ethel probably would have gone down that route herself and become some kind of therapist, psychotherapist, analyst. And, you know, it just reinforces the sense of what a loss that she would have had something to offer the world.
Had she given other interviews before? I really don't remember seeing her name in other materials.
Well, there was one other book written about Ethel 40 years ago, so before a lot of information came out. And in a sense, that author had an advantage because more people were alive, but our understanding and information has moved on. So I felt 40 years was a goodly time for a different look at this story.
Yeah, certainly. The dribbling of news and new material is, I think, one of the things that's kept the story going a little bit, particularly, as you noted, the grand jury testimony of David. You couldn't write about it until 2014 or 2015, right? And so there have been reasons to keep the story alive just as new material has come out. Do you have any sense that any more might?
Well, I was going to say, I think any biographer is arrogant who insists that theirs is the definitive version. It's the version that you write at that moment in time with the best access to the knowledge that is available. And any biography is subjective. Of course it is. You know, unless you're going to write 900 pages, you have to decide what you're going to include that seems relevant, that seems truthful, that isn't based on hearsay. And of course there'll be new information. Every story has new information. So, you know, I would be a fool if I didn't admit that.
Well said. I always say that historians should never say never, because those are famous last words, really. We have no more questions. And so, Linda, do you want to return?
I'm back. It was an extraordinary conversation. Thank you so much, Anne and David. Great questions, David and Anne. An extraordinary book. I encourage everyone to, if you haven't read the book, get the book. I know in our chat box, Nikki, and I want to thank Nikki Snyder, our virtual media manager, for handling the technology here, but she's going to put a link into the chat box where you can click on and get Anne's book. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, and just want to remind everyone we're open 7 days a week, and continue to browsing and curbside pickup and all the things that one wants in their bookstore, local bookstore. Again, many thanks to Anne Sebba for extraordinary book, for David Steigerwald at Ohio State University's History Department, extraordinary preparation and great questions. And thank you all for spending part of your evening with us. And we hope to you to join us again soon. And we hope to see people in person. Thank you and good evening.
Thanks, Linda.
Thank you all. Thank you.